She was building her stone cabin alone, one back-breaking rock at a time, unaware that the Cherokee warrior watching from the pine shadows had been declared dead by his own people and was living as a ghost between two worlds that would both kill him if they discovered the truth. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits as Aurora Sterling dragged another limestone boulder toward the foundation she'd been laying for 3 weeks. Her hands, once soft enough to play piano in Denver drawing rooms, were now calloused and bleeding through torn gloves. The purple bruises on her arms had faded to yellow, but the memories they carried remained sharp as winter wind. She'd chosen this isolated valley 15 miles north of Durango for good reason.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
No roads led here, no homesteaders had claimed the surrounding land, and most importantly, no one would think to look for a dead woman in a place where only eagles dared to nest. The local sheriff back in town still carried the wanted poster, with her face on it, offering $500 for information leading to the capture of Aurora Sterling, wanted for the murder of her husband, Jonathan Sterling. Prominent businessman and pillar of the community. What the poster didn't mention was that Jonathan Sterling had been beating his wife senseless every night for 2 years, or that he'd threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave him. What it definitely didn't mention was that Aurora had acted in self-defense when he'd come at her with a fire poker, drunk and raging because she dared to suggest they might move somewhere smaller, somewhere he couldn't gamble away everything. They owned the memory of that night still haunted her sleep. Jonathan had come home from another losing streak at the gambling tables, reeking of whiskey and cheap perfume from whatever saloon girl had taken his money along with his pride. Aurora had been darning socks by lamplight, trying to make their dwindling household budget stretch another week, when he'd stormed into their bedroom with fury blazing in his bloodshot eyes. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" He'd snarled, loosening his belt with the practiced ease of someone who'd used it as a weapon many times before. "Suggesting we sell the house, move somewhere cheaper, making me look like a failure in front of the whole town." Aurora had tried to explain, tried to reason with him, but Jonathan was beyond hearing. He'd grabbed the iron poker from beside their bedroom fireplace, raising it above his head with clear intent to crush her skull. In that moment, facing certain death, Aurora had done the only thing she could. She'd fought back. The struggle had been brief but violent. When it was over, Jonathan lay still on their bedroom floor, his own poker buried in his chest, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling he'd never see again. Aurora had stood over his body for what felt like hours, her nightgown soaked with blood, her hands shaking so violently she could barely pack the small bag that would carry her into exile. She'd known that no jury would believe her story. Jonathan Sterling was respected, wealthy, connected to all the right people. Aurora was just his wife, a woman with no independent income, no family to defend her, no voice that would carry weight against his posthumous reputation. So she'd taken the money from Jonathan's safe, his best horse, and his Colt revolver, and had ridden into the night like a ghost fleeing back to whatever hell had spawned her. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of hard travel through wilderness that wanted to kill her almost as much as civilization did. 3 weeks of planning, searching, and finally finding this hidden valley that would either become her salvation or her tomb. The stone cabin she was building would be her sanctuary, her fortress, her proof that Aurora Sterling wasn't dead. She'd just been reborn. Every rock she lifted was an act of defiance against a world that had tried to crush her spirit. Every wall she raised was a barrier against the past that haunted her sleep. She would build this home with her own hands, and no man would ever again have the power to take it from her. The work was backbreaking, harder than anything she'd ever attempted. Each stone had to be carefully selected for size and shape, then dragged or rolled into position with equipment she'd fashioned from salvaged timber and rope. Her back ached constantly. Her muscles screamed in protest every morning when she forced herself to rise before dawn. And her hands were so raw that even holding a cup of coffee sent fire through her palms. But the pain was good. The pain meant she was alive, that she was fighting, that she was building something permanent in a world that had proven temporary and treacherous. Every blister was proof of her independence, every sore muscle evidence that she was strong enough to survive anything the world threw at her. What Aurora didn't know was that for the past week, someone had been watching her from the tree line. Someone who understood what it meant to be hunted, to live between life and death, to build something from nothing in a world that wanted you erased. Talon Riverwolf crouched motionless behind a massive ponderosa pine, his dark eyes tracking the woman's movements as she wrestled with stones that should have been too heavy for someone her size. He'd been observing her ritual every morning since she'd arrived, fascinated by her determination and disturbed by the obvious signs of recent violence he could read in her careful movements. The way she favored her left side, the protective way she held herself whenever she heard unexpected sounds from the forest. In Cherokee tradition, Talon had been taught to read stories in everything. The way animals moved through forest, the patterns clouds made across sky, the subtle signs that revealed truth beneath surface appearances. The woman building the stone cabin was carrying secrets as heavy as the rock she lifted, and those secrets had left marks on more than just her hands. Talon had his own reasons for hiding in these mountains. According to Cherokee tribal law, he was dead killed in honorable combat defending his sister's honor against a white traitor who'd tried to force himself on her. But Talon hadn't died in that fight. He'd killed the traitor instead, and in doing so, had signed his own death warrant. The tribal council couldn't openly celebrate the death of a white man, not when tensions with the territorial government were already at a breaking point. So they declared Talon dead, held a funeral ceremony, and quietly told him to disappear forever. The memory of that day still burned in his chest like swallowed fire. Marcus Henley had been a fur trader with connections to the territorial legislature, a man who used his political influence to cheat Cherokee families out of fair prices for their pelts and hides. When Henley had cornered Talon's sister Ayanna behind the trading post and tried to force himself on her, demanding payment for what he claimed were debts her family owed, Talon had intervened with the fury of a man defending everything sacred in his world. The fight had been brutal but decisive. Henley had drawn a knife, confident that his size and experience would overwhelm a savage half his age. He'd been wrong. Talon had learned to fight from Cherokee warriors who'd survived removal, relocation, and decades of conflict with white settlers. When the struggle ended, Henley lay dead with his own blade buried between his ribs, his blood soaking into earth that would soon be forbidden to Cherokee feet. Within hours, territorial authorities were demanding justice for the murder of a respected businessman. The Cherokee Council, already walking a razor's edge between survival and annihilation, couldn't afford to protect Talon openly. So they'd made him officially dead, held a ceremony, buried an empty grave, and told him he could never return to Cherokee lands as long as he drew breath. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, he'd been living like a ghost, moving between Cherokee territory and white settlements, belonging to neither world, welcome in both only as long as his true identity remained hidden. He hunted game that he traded to isolated homesteaders for supplies, careful never to stay in one place long enough to draw attention. He'd been planning to move on from this valley too, until the woman arrived. Something about her fierce independence, her refusal to be broken by whatever had driven her to this desolate place, reminded him of his sister Ayanna. More than that, it reminded him of himself, another soul trying to build a new life from the rubble of an old one that had been destroyed by violence. Every morning for a week, he'd watched her rise before dawn, eat a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then begin the grueling work of stone selection and placement. She worked with methodical precision,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Clearly following some kind of plan, but Talon could see that her progress was painfully slow. At her current pace, she'd be lucky to have walls up before the first snow, and winter came early and brutal in these mountains. More concerning were the signs of inexperience he observed in her technique. She was selecting stones based on size, alone, not considering how their shapes would fit together. She was lifting rocks that were too heavy for her frame, risking injury that could leave her helpless in the wilderness. Most dangerous of all, she was building without proper foundation preparation. The freeze-thaw cycles of mountain winter would crack her walls apart unless she dug deeper and laid a proper frost line. Talon found himself caught between admiration for her courage and concern for her survival. This woman was fighting a battle against time, weather, and her own limitations, and she was losing. Without help, her stone cabin would become her stone tomb. But offering help meant exposing himself, revealing his presence to someone who might recognize his face from wanted posters or tribal descriptions. It meant risking the fragile safety he'd built through months of careful isolation. It meant trusting a stranger with secrets that could get him killed or worse, captured alive and turned over to authorities, who would make his death slow and public as an example to other savage murderers. Aurora straightened slowly, pressing both hands to her lower back as she surveyed her progress. The foundation was taking shape, but even she could see that time was running out. The aspens were already beginning to turn gold at higher elevations, and morning frost had started appearing on the grass around her campsite. She'd brought enough supplies for 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she rationed carefully. After that, she'd have to risk trips to town for food and tools, each journey an opportunity to be recognized, captured, and hanged for a crime that had been her only choice for survival. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was racing against time to build a home before she'd be forced to abandon it. Every stone she placed brought her closer to shelter, but also closer to the moment when her supplies would run out, and her hiding place would become a trap dot as she bent to select the next stone. Aurora heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps. Deliberate, careful, but not quite silent enough to escape notice. Her hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver tucked into her belt, the gun she'd taken from Jonathan's body before fleeing Denver in the middle of the night. "I know you're there," she called out, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Show yourself, or I'll assume you mean me harm." The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through pine needles. Aurora waited, counting her heartbeats, calculating distances to cover, planning her escape route if this turned into a fight she couldn't win. She'd killed once in self-defense. She could do it again if necessary, but she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. She was tired of violence, tired of death, tired of running from shadows that might or might not be pursuing her. Then he stepped from behind the massive pine, and Aurora's breath caught in her throat. The man was tall and lean, with the fluid movements of someone equally comfortable in wilderness and civilization. His black hair hung loose to his shoulders, and his skin spoke of mixed Cherokee heritage. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was far more than just another mountain man or drifter. Most striking were his eyes, dark as midnight, but somehow warm, carrying depths of understanding that seemed to see straight through to her soul. This was not a man who would judge her for the choices she'd been forced to make. This was someone who understood what it meant to make impossible decisions in a world that offered only impossible choices. "My name is Talon," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but spoke it with careful precision. "I've been watching you work. You're building in the old way, stone, by hand. It's good, strong work, but it's also slow work for one person." Aurora's grip on her revolver didn't relax. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. And strangers in the wilderness were more likely to be threats than salvation. Are you here to help or to cause trouble? Because I've had enough trouble to last several lifetimes. A ghost of a smile crossed Talon's features, and Aurora caught a glimpse of pain in his eyes that matched her own. I know the feeling. He gestured toward her foundation, studying it with the eye of someone who understood stonework. You're planning to winter here? That's the idea. Aurora's voice carried more confidence than she felt. The truth was, she wasn't sure she'd survive the winter even if she managed to complete the cabin. Her supplies were limited, her knowledge of wilderness survival was purely theoretical, and every day brought new challenges she hadn't anticipated. Then you'll need help, Talon said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than condescending. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and winter's coming faster than you think. I can smell snow in the air already. You've got maybe 6 weeks before the first storm hits. Aurora studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motive. What she saw instead was something she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine concern from someone who asked for nothing in return. When was the last time anyone had looked at her with anything other than lust, anger, or fear? Why would you help me? She asked. You don't know me. You don't know why I'm here, or what I might have done. Talon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the bruises still visible on her wrists, to the careful way she held herself, to the determination in her eyes that no amount of pain had been able to break. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much suffering in his short life. I know enough, he said finally. I know you're running from something that hurt you. I know you're trying to build something new with your own hands instead of depending on others. And I know what it's like to be declared dead by the world, while still fighting to stay alive. The last words hit Aurora like a physical blow. This stranger, this Cherokee man who'd appeared from the forest like something from a dream, somehow understood exactly what she was going through. He'd used almost the exact words she'd been thinking. Declared dead by the world while still fighting to stay alive. What's your story? She asked, lowering her gun slightly, but not putting it away entirely. She'd learned to be cautious with her trust, but something about this man's presence felt different from any threat she'd faced before. Long and complicated, Talon replied, settling into a crouch that suggested he was prepared to talk as long as necessary. But the short version is that I died 8 months ago defending my sister's honor, except I didn't actually die. Now I live between worlds, belonging to neither, trying to figure out how to build a life when officially I don't exist. Aurora felt something loosen in her chest, the tight knot of isolation she'd been carrying since the night she'd killed Jonathan. Here was someone who truly understood what it meant to be erased. To start over with nothing but determination and the clothes on your back. Here was someone who knew the weight of carrying secrets that could get you killed if they fell into the wrong hands. Aurora, she said, finally introducing herself but not lowering her guard entirely. Aurora Sterling, also officially dead as of 3 weeks ago. What killed Aurora Sterling? Talon asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. He'd seen enough marks of violence on enough victims to recognize the signs. A husband who thought his wife was property he could break whenever he got frustrated with the world. Aurora's voice carried no self-pity, just simple fact delivered with the quiet strength of someone who'd survived the unsurvivable. He was wrong. Talon nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. And now you're building a new life, stone by stone. That's the plan. Aurora gestured toward her half-completed foundation, allowing a note of bitter humor to creep into her voice. Assuming I can get it built before winter, before my supplies run out, or before someone recognizes me and decides $500 is worth turning in a dead woman. $500 is a lot of money, Talon observed, but there was no greed in his voice, just acknowledgement of the danger she faced. Aurora's hand tightened on her gun again. But Talon held up both hands in a peaceful gesture, showing calloused palms that spoke of honest work and hard living. "I'm not interested in bounty money," he said. "But I am interested in helping someone who reminds me that survival is possible, even when the world wants you gone." For several heartbeats, they stood facing each other across the foundation stones, two people who'd been declared dead by circumstances beyond their control, two souls trying to build something permanent in a world that had proven temporary and dangerous. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the scope of the work still ahead. Finally, Aurora made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Can you work with stone?" she asked. Cherokee built with stone for centuries before the white man came with his wooden houses, Talon replied, pride evident in his voice. "My grandfather taught me to read rock like others read books, which stones will hold, which will crack, how to build walls that will stand for generations." "Then I suppose we're partners," Aurora said, extending her hand with a mixture of hope and caution. "At least until the cabin's finished." When Talon shook her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong against hers, Aurora felt something she hadn't experienced since before Jonathan's first blowhole. Maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the coming winter alone. Maybe, for the first time in years, she'd found someone who understood what it meant to be strong enough to survive anything, yet brave enough to trust again, what neither of them knew was that building the cabin would be the easy part. The real challenge would be learning to trust each other with secrets that could get them both killed, and discovering that sometimes the strongest foundations are built not from stone, but from two damaged hearts choosing to heal together. As the morning mist burned away under the strengthening sun, Aurora and Talon began selecting stones for the cabin's first wall. Each rock they placed was a small act of defiance against a world that had tried to bury them both. Each stone they lifted together was proof that even the dead could choose to live again. Winter was coming, but for the first time since fleeing Denver, Aurora Sterling wasn't afraid of the cold. The partnership began with awkward silence and careful distance. Aurora woke before dawn, as had become her habit, to find Talon already crouched beside her campfire, feeding split pine into the coals with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent countless nights under open sky. He'd built the fire up without waking her, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from a battered tin pot balanced on the flames. "You didn't have to do that," Aurora said, emerging from her bedroll with her hand still instinctively near her revolver. 3 weeks of solitude had taught her to be suspicious of kindness, especially from strangers who appeared from nowhere offering help. "Coffee's better when someone else makes it," Talon replied without looking up from the fire, Cherokee saying. Aurora studied his profile in the firelight, searching for any sign that he was mocking her or testing her boundaries. What she saw instead was simple pragmatism, a man who understood that survival in the wilderness required cooperation, not competition. "Is that really a Cherokee saying?" she asked, accepting the tin cup he offered. "No," Talon admitted, and for the first time since they'd met, Aurora saw him smile. "But it should be." The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate blends she'd once served in her Denver parlor, but it warmed her from the inside out and helped chase away the lingering chill of mountain morning. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the valley walls gold and rose, Aurora found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since Jonathan's death. "So how do we do this?" she asked finally, gesturing toward the stone foundation that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. "I mean, I know how to lift rocks and stack them, but you seem to know something about actually building with them." Talon set down his coffee cup and moved to the foundation, running his hands along the stones she'd already placed. His touch was gentle but analytical, reading the rock like others might read a book. After several minutes of examination, he shook his head. "This won't hold," he said, his voice carrying no judgment, just fact. Good stones, good intention. But wrong approach. Mountain winters will tear this apart in the first freeze. Aurora felt her heart sink. 3 weeks of backbreaking labor, reduced to rubble by someone who'd been watching her work for less than a week. What's wrong with it? Foundation's too shallow, stones aren't properly fitted, no drainage system for snowmelt. Talon pointed to specific areas as he spoke, his explanations clear and patient. You're building like someone who learned from books, not from watching what works in these mountains. Because I did learn from books, Aurora admitted, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. I found a manual on stone construction in Jonathan's library. I thought if I followed the instructions. Exactly. Books are written by people who've never had to survive a Colorado winter in a house they built with their own hands. Talon said, Cherokee built to last generations, not just seasons. If we're going to do this, we do it right. The word we hung in the air between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with stone construction. Aurora realized that somewhere in the space of a single conversation, she'd gone from solitary survivor to partner in an enterprise that would require trust, cooperation, and shared risk. What does doing it right involve? She asked. Tearing out what you've built and starting over. Aurora's first instinct was to argue, to defend the work that had cost her blood, sweat, and weeks of grinding effort. But as she looked at her foundation with Talon's explanation fresh in her mind, she could see the flaws he'd identified. The stones were indeed poorly fitted, leaving gaps that would collect moisture and expand when it froze. The depth was inadequate for the frost lying in these mountains. Most damning of all, she'd built without considering drainage, meaning spring snowmelt would undermine everything she'd accomplished. How long will it take? She asked, surprised by her own willingness to abandon weeks of work, to do it right. 2 weeks if we work from dawn to dusk, 3 if we take time to do it properly. Talon studied her face, perhaps reading the calculation she was doing in her head. I know you're worried about time, about supplies running out before winter. But better to build once and have it last than to build twice and freeze to death. When it falls down. Aurora made the hardest decision she'd faced since fleeing Denver. Show me how to do it right. What followed was the most intensive education of Aurora's life. Talon didn't just teach her how to build with stone. He taught her how to think like stone, to understand the language of rock and mortar that had been spoken by his people for countless generations. They began by dismantling her original foundation, a process that was both physically exhausting and emotionally devastating. Each stone she'd placed with such care had to be examined, sorted, and often discarded if it showed signs of weakness or poor shape. Talon's standards were unforgiving, but his explanations helped Aurora understand the reasoning behind every decision. This one, he said, hefting a limestone boulder that had taken Aurora an entire morning to drag into position, has a crack running through the center. Invisible now, but the first hard freeze will split it in half. Foundation stone has to be perfect, everything else depends on it. Aurora found herself looking at rocks with new eyes, seeing flaws and strengths she'd never noticed before. Talon taught her to test stones by sound, tapping them with a small hammer and listening for the clear ring that indicated solid material versus the dull thunk that warned of internal cracks. He showed her how to read the grain of sedimentary rock, identifying the layers that would provide strength versus those that would crumble under pressure. Cherokee say that stone speaks to those who know how to listen. Talon explained as they worked through their second day together. Every rock tells a story, where it came from, how it was formed, what stresses it can handle. Learning to hear those stories is the difference between building something that lasts and building something that kills you when it falls down. But stone selection was only the beginning. Talon insisted they dig the foundation deeper than Aurora had originally planned, going down 3 feet to reach stable soil that wouldn't shift with freeze-thaw cycles. The work was brutal. Mountain soil was rocky and root-bound, requiring picks and shovels and countless hours of backbreaking labor. Why so deep? Aurora gasped during a break on their third day, her hands bleeding despite the leather gloves Talon had somehow produced from his minimal belongings. Because in Cherokee territory, we had winters that would freeze the ground solid for 4 months straight, Talon replied, attacking the stubborn soil with steady rhythm. If your foundation isn't below the frost line, the expanding earth will. Heave your walls apart like they were made of children's blocks. Aurora wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. How do you know the frost line for these particular mountains? Same way I know which plants are safe to eat and which streams run clean, by paying attention to what the land tells you. Talon gestured toward the surrounding forest. See how the aspen roots don't go deep here? See how the pine trees grow? Wide instead of tall. The land shows you its limits if you know how to read the signs. As they worked, Aurora found herself learning far more than construction techniques. Talon possessed a depth of knowledge about wilderness survival that made her realize how ignorant she'd been about the environment she'd chosen for her refuge. He showed her which plants could be eaten in emergency, how to read weather patterns. In cloud formations, where to find water when obvious sources ran dry. You came here planning to hide, he observed one evening as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and wild onions. But you didn't plan to live. Aurora considered his words as she chewed the surprisingly flavorful stew. Talon was right. Her focus had been entirely on escape, on putting distance between herself and the life that had nearly destroyed her. She hadn't thought much beyond basic survival, certainly not about building a sustainable existence in the wilderness. I didn't think I'd live long enough for it to matter, she admitted. Every day I expected bounty hunters to ride into the valley, or winter to kill me, or my supplies to run out and force me back to civilization where someone would recognize me. And now? Aurora looked around their campsite, taking in the neat pile of sorted stones, the properly excavated foundation, the small improvements Talon had made to her shelter and equipment. Now I'm starting to think maybe I can actually do this. Build. Something that lasts, I mean. Good, Talon said simply. Because stonework requires faith in the future. No one builds something meant to last generations unless they believe they'll be around to see it age. It was during their 5th day working together that Aurora learned the full scope of the danger Talon carried with him. They were fitting stones. For the foundation's corner posts, a delicate process that required precise measurements and careful placement. When the sound of approaching horses echoed up the valley, Aurora's blood turned to ice. Horses meant riders, and riders meant either bounty hunters looking for her or territorial authorities looking for Talon. Either way, discovery meant death for one or both of them. How many? Talon asked, his voice calm despite the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Aurora listened carefully to the rhythm of hoofbeats on rocky ground. 3 horses, maybe 4. Still a mile down the valley, but coming this way. Without discussion, they both moved to cover their worksite. Aurora scattered loose stones to disguise the foundation excavation while Talon kicked dirt over their campfire and gathered their tools. Within minutes, the valley looked uninhabited except for the natural scatter of rocks and the cold ashes of what might have been a lightning-struck tree. They retreated to a defensive position among the pine trees where Talon produced a rifle Aurora hadn't known he was carrying. The weapon was old but well-maintained, its stock carved with symbols she didn't recognize, but suspected were Cherokee. Military patrol, Talon said after studying the approaching riders through gaps in the forest. Territorial militia, not regular army. Looking for something specific. Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs. How can you tell? Formation, equipment, the way they're reading the ground. These aren't men on routine patrol, they're tracking someone. As the riders drew closer, Aurora could make out their leader, a tall man in a blue uniform with sergeant stripes, his face weathered by years of frontier service. He rode like someone accustomed to command, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of human passage. "Spread out," the sergeant called to his men. "Check every clearing, every shelter, every place someone might camp. We know he's in these mountains somewhere." Aurora glanced at Talon, whose jaw had tightened with recognition. "They're looking for you," she whispered. "Appears so." Talon's voice carried no surprise, just resignation. "Question is whether they have good enough information to find this valley." The patrol spent nearly an hour searching the area below Aurora's hidden campsite. She watched through the trees as they examined every rock formation, every game trail, every sign that human beings might have passed through the wilderness. Their leader was thorough and methodical, a man who understood that small details often revealed large secrets. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the patrol moved on toward the north end of the valley. Aurora and Talon remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the distance. "They'll be back," Talon said, shouldering his rifle with practiced ease. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll keep searching until they find what they're looking for. Which is you, presumably. Dead or alive, though they'd prefer alive for the public execution." Talon's voice carried bitter knowledge. Killing a white man, even in defense of family, is considered an act of war by territorial authorities. They want to make an example that will discourage other savages from protecting their women. Aurora felt a surge of anger at the injustice, but also fear for what association with Talon might mean for her own safety. "Maybe you should move on," she said carefully. "Find somewhere more remote where they won't think to look." Talon studied her face, reading emotions she hadn't realized she was displaying. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to be safe," Aurora corrected. "And I want to survive long enough to finish this cabin. If they're actively hunting you, staying here puts us both at risk." "True." Talon was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on the valley below where the patrol had searched for signs of their presence. "But leaving you alone puts you at different kind of risk. Winter's coming whether soldiers find me or not. And you'll freeze to death in a half-built cabin if you try to finish it alone." Aurora realized they'd reached a crucial decision point in their partnership. Continue working together and risk discovery by military patrols, or separate and face their individual dangers alone. Neither option offered safety, only different varieties of peril. "How much time do we need?" she asked. "To finish the cabin, I mean. To get it weatherproof and livable. 6 weeks minimum. 8 to do it properly." Talon gestured toward there. "Excavated foundation. Stonework can't be rushed, mortar needs time to cure. Walls need time to settle. Push too hard, and you end up with a pile of rocks instead of a house." Aurora did the math in her head. 6 to 8 weeks meant working into November, possibly December. It meant facing the first snows while still building. Meant gambling that Talon could evade capture long enough to complete their work. "What are the chances they'll find us if we stay?" she asked. Talon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Hard to say. This valley's well hidden, no obvious trails leading in. But that sergeant knows his business, and they've got plenty of manpower to search systematically. If I had to guess, I'd say 50-50 odds they locate us before winter shuts down their operations. And if they do find us, they'll hang me from the nearest tree and probably arrest you as an accomplice. Consorting with fugitive Indians is a federal crime in this territory." Aurora absorbed this information, weighing it against the alternative of facing Colorado winter alone in an unfinished stone cabin. The choice wasn't really a choice at all without Talon's help. She would certainly die of cold or starvation before spring. With his help, she might die of bullet or rope, but at least she'd have a fighting chance. "Then we'd better work fast." She said what emerged over the following days was a partnership unlike anything Aurora had experienced in her marriage or her previous life. Where Jonathan had demanded submission and obedience, Talon offered collaboration and mutual respect. Where her Denver social circle had valued appearance over substance, Talon cared only about competence and character. They developed a rhythm that maximized both efficiency and security. Aurora would rise before dawn to scout the valley approaches, while Talon prepared breakfast and organized the day's materials. They worked through the morning on foundation stones, broke during the heat of midday to rest and plan, then resumed construction until dusk. Evenings were spent preparing meals, maintaining tools, and discussing the next day's priorities. Talon proved to be not just knowledgeable about stonework, but a natural teacher. He explained each technique thoroughly, demonstrated proper form, then watched patiently as Aurora practiced until she could perform the task correctly. When she made mistakes, and she made many, he corrected her without condescension or frustration. "Learning takes time," he said one afternoon after Aurora had spent an hour trying to fit a particularly stubborn cornerstone. Cherokee children spend years watching their elders work before they're allowed to place their first foundation stone. You're learning in weeks what most take seasons to master. Aurora wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving another streak of dirt across her face. "Sometimes I feel like I'm learning everything backwards. How to survive before how to live. How to build before how to plan. How to trust before how to judge character." "Maybe that's not backwards," Talon suggested. "Maybe that's just a different kind of wisdom." As they worked, Aurora found herself sharing pieces of her story she'd never told anyone. Not the basic facts, those were stark and simple enough, but the emotional reality of living with fear, the gradual erosion of hope that had preceded Jonathan's final violence, the complex guilt she felt about taking a human life even in self-defense. "I keep wondering if there was another way," she admitted one evening as they shared another of Talon's expertly prepared meals. "If I could have reasoned with him, or left earlier, or found help somehow." "Cherokee have a saying," Talon replied. "When the mountain lion attacks, you don't negotiate. You fight or you die." Jonathan wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't he? Talon's voice carried gentle challenge. "He hunted you in your own home, stalked you through your daily life, used his superior strength to terrorize someone he should have protected. What else would you call that?" Aurora had never thought of her marriage in those terms, but the comparison was disturbingly accurate. Jonathan had indeed been a predator, using law and social convention to trap prey that couldn't escape through normal means. Fighting back hadn't just been self-defense. It had been the only form of justice available to her. In return, Talon shared fragments of his own story. The political complexity of Cherokee relations with territorial government, the impossible position his tribal council had faced when forced to choose between protecting one man and preserving their entire community's fragile peace with white authorities. "They saved my life by declaring me dead," he explained. "Gave me a chance to disappear instead of facing execution. I understand why they made that choice, but understanding doesn't make the exile easier to bear. Do you miss it? Cherokee territory. I mean, your family, your people, every day." Talon stared into their campfire, flames reflecting in his dark eyes. But missing something and being able to return to it are different things. Some bridges burn so completely that crossing back becomes impossible. Aurora understood that sentiment all too well. Her own bridges to civilization had been burned just as thoroughly, leaving her stranded in wilderness that was becoming less foreign and more like home with each passing day. As their second week of partnership drew to a close, the foundation finally reached completion. What had once been a rough excavation had become a precisely fitted base of carefully selected stones, each one tested for strength and positioned for maximum stability. Drainage channels directed water away from the structure, and the depth provided protection against frost heave that would threaten lesser construction. Standing beside their completed work as the sun set behind the western peaks, Aurora felt a satisfaction she'd never experienced in her previous life. This foundation hadn't been purchased with inherited money or built by hired workers. Every stone had been placed by her own hands, every decision made through her own growing understanding of what it meant to build something meant to last. "It's beautiful," she said, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "It's functional," Talon corrected, but his tone carried approval. "Beauty comes from things that work the way they're supposed to work." As they prepared for sleep that night, Aurora realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with both Talon and the wilderness surrounding them. She was no longer a refugee hiding from civilization. She was a woman building a new life with skills she was learning and tools she was mastering. The valley was no longer just a place to hide, it was becoming home. But even as confidence grew in her ability to complete the cabin, Aurora couldn't shake the knowledge that soldiers were still searching the mountains, that every day of construction brought them closer to discovery. The foundation was complete, but the walls would take much longer to build. And winter was approaching with the inevitability of Judgment Day. 3 weeks into their partnership, Aurora discovered that building walls was an entirely different challenge from laying foundations. Where foundation work had been about precision and permanence, wall construction required an almost artistic sense of balance and proportion that she struggled to master. Each stone had to fit not just with its immediate neighbors, but with the overall pattern that would distribute weight evenly throughout the structure. "Think like water," Talon instructed as Aurora wrestled with a particularly stubborn section of the eastern wall. "Water always finds the path of least resistance. If your stones aren't fitted properly, that's where the wall will fail when pressure builds." Aurora stepped back from her work, wiping limestone dust from her hands as she studied the section she'd been building. Even to her untrained eye, she could see that something was wrong with the pattern. The stones seemed to fight against each other rather than supporting one another, creating lines of weakness that would become cracks under stress. "I'm thinking too much like a city person," she admitted, trying to make everything straight and uniform instead of working with what the stones want to do naturally. "Cherokee builders say that stone has memory," Talon replied, running his hands along a section of wall they'd completed the previous day. "It remembers how it was formed, what pressures shaped it, which way it naturally wants to rest. Fight against that memory and the stone will fight back. Work with it, and the stone becomes your partner." This concept of stone having memory was foreign to everything Aurora had learned about construction from her reading. But as she watched Talon work, she began to understand what he meant. He would hold each stone for several moments before placing it, turning it in different orientations, listening to some internal voice that told him which position would provide maximum strength and stability. When Aurora tried to replicate his technique, she felt clumsy and uncertain. Her hands didn't seem to speak the same language as the limestone blocks, and she found herself forcing stones into positions that looked right, but felt wrong. "It takes time," Talon said, noticing her frustration. "Cherokee children grow up handling stone from the time they can walk. You're learning in weeks what most absorb over years." "We don't have years," Aurora replied, glancing toward the aspens that were now brilliant gold against the darker green of pine and spruce. "We barely have weeks before the first snow." It was a reality that weighed on both of them as they worked. The morning temperatures were dropping steadily, and frost had begun appearing regularly on the grass around their campsite. More concerning, the military patrols had intensified their searches, with riders appearing in the surrounding valleys almost daily. The interruption came on a gray October morning when low clouds hung over the valley like a wool blanket. Aurora was mixing mortar while Talon selected stones for the day's work when the sound of a single horse approached from the southern end of the valley. Unlike the military patrols they'd been avoiding, this was clearly a civilian rider. The Horse moved at an easy walk rather than the purposeful trot of soldiers on patrol. But civilian didn't necessarily mean safe, and Aurora felt her familiar spike of adrenaline as she reached for the revolver that had become as much a part of her daily outfit as her work gloves. "Stay calm," Talon murmured, though his own hand had moved to the knife at his belt. Might just be a lost traveler or a hunter who wandered too far from the main trails. The rider who emerged from the tree line was neither soldier nor hunter, but something potentially more dangerous, a well-dressed man in his 50s, wearing the kind of expensive coat and hat that marked him as someone with money and influence. His horse was a quality animal, well-fed and properly shod, suggesting he wasn't some desperate prospector or drifter. Most concerning of all, he rode directly toward their worksite with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. "Miss Sterling," the man called out as he approached, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone who'd spent time in eastern cities. Or should I say, the late Mrs. Jonathan Sterling. Aurora's blood turned to ice. This stranger not only knew her real name, but was aware of her supposed death. That meant he was either a bounty hunter with access to detailed information about her case, or someone connected to Jonathan's business dealings who had reason to track down his widow. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Aurora replied, her hand resting casually on her gun butt. "My name is Rose Brennan, and this is my cousin Tom. We're homesteading this valley." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Please, Mrs. Sterling, let's not insult each other's intelligence. I've been tracking you for over a month, following a trail that led from Denver to Durango to this very remote valley. You're a difficult woman to find, but not impossible." Talon had positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of the visitor. Aurora noticed close enough to intervene if the situation turned violent, but not so obviously threatening as to provoke an immediate confrontation. "What do you want?" Aurora asked, abandoning any pretense of false identity. "My name is Marcus Webb," the man replied, dismounting with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in the saddle. "I was your late husband's business partner in several mining ventures. More importantly, I was the co-signer on several loans that Jonathan took out using your Denver property as collateral." Aurora felt a new kind of dread settle in her stomach. Jonathan's gambling and business failures had been spiraling out of control in the months before his death, but she'd assumed that his debts had died with him. "Jonathan's dead," she said. "Whatever he owed you died with him." Actually, that's not quite true. Webb reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid provoking a violent response, and withdrew a leather portfolio. "According to the terms of our agreement, if Jonathan died before the loans were repaid, responsibility for the debt transferred to his surviving spouse. That would be you." "I'm not his surviving spouse," Aurora said quickly. "I'm legally dead, remember? You said so yourself." Webb's smile widened. "Ah, but that's where things get interesting. You see, the authorities never found a body, did they? Just blood and signs of struggle, which could indicate murder, kidnapping, or simply a very clever woman staging her own death to escape inconvenient circumstances." Aurora glanced at Talon, who was watching the exchange with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating potential threats. Webb hadn't acknowledged Talon's presence beyond an initial dismissive glance, apparently categorizing him as hired help rather than a potential threat. "What are you proposing?" Aurora asked. "Simple business transaction," Webb replied, opening his portfolio to reveal several official-looking documents. "You signed these papers transferring ownership of the Denver property to my company, and I forget I ever found you. Continue playing dead, build your little cabin, live happily ever after in the wilderness. And if I refuse, then I return to Denver with proof that Aurora Sterling is very much alive, wanted for murder, and hiding in the Colorado Territory under a false name. The territorial marshal would be very interested in that information, don't you think?" Aurora realized she was trapped between two equally dangerous options: sign Webb's papers and lose any legal claim to the property that represented her only, financial security, or refuse and face arrest for murder. Either way, Webb held all the cards. "I need time to consider your offer," she said. "Of course, I'm a reasonable man." Webb tucked the documents back into his portfolio. "I'll be camping at the southern end of the valley tonight. You can give me your answer in the morning." As Webb remounted his horse and rode away, Aurora felt the careful stability she'd built over the past month crumbling like poorly mortared stone. Just when she'd begun to believe she might actually survive and build a new life, the past had reached out with grasping fingers to drag her back into the world she'd tried to escape. That night, as they sat beside their campfire eating a dinner neither had much appetite for, Talon finally spoke the words Aurora had been dreading to hear. "You should sign his papers," he said quietly. "Take his deal and hope he keeps his word about forgetting he found you. You think I should just give up everything Jonathan and I worked for? Let some crooked business partner steal our property because he's got me backed into a corner?" "I think you should stay alive," Talon replied. "Property isn't worth dying for, and if this Webb character turns you into authorities, that's exactly what will happen. They'll hang you for your husband's murder, and all the Denver real estate in the world won't matter then." Aurora poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the cold night air. "It's not just about the money, though. That's part of it. That property represents the only proof I have that my life before this actually existed. If I sign it away, it's like admitting that Aurora Sterling really is dead, that everything I was before coming here doesn't matter." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Talon said carefully. "Maybe Aurora Sterling was meant to stay buried, so someone new could be born." Aurora looked at him sharply. "Is that what you did? Buried Talon Riverwolf so completely that he might as well be dead?" Talon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames with an expression Aurora had learned to recognize as internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain that seemed to echo from deep places in his soul. "There's something I haven't told you about why I'm really here," he said. "Something that changes everything about the choice you're facing." Aurora felt her stomach tighten. Over the past month, she'd come to trust Talon more completely than she'd ever trusted anyone, including Jonathan. The thought that he'd been hiding crucial information from her felt like betrayal. What kind of something? The kind that means Marcus Webb isn't the only person looking for you, and signing his papers won't make you safe. Talon met her eyes. Across the fire. 3 days ago, when I went hunting in the eastern valleys, I saw another group of riders. Not military this time, civilian clothes, expensive horses, the kind of men who get paid well for dangerous work. Bounty hunters. Professional. Trackers, probably hired by someone with serious money to spend. They were asking questions in the trading posts, showing a photograph, offering rewards for information about a woman matching your description. Aurora felt the world tilt sideways. How much of a reward? $5,000. The number hit Aurora like a physical blow. $5,000 was 10 times the official bounty on her head, the kind of money that would motivate every drifter, prospector, and desperate man in the territory to join the hunt for her location. Who has that kind of money to spend on? "Finding me?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Someone who believes you're worth more alive than dead," Talon replied. "Someone who thinks you have something valuable enough to justify that kind of expenditure." Aurora's mind raced through the possibilities. Jonathan had been involved in numerous business ventures, some of them questionable, others potentially illegal. If he'd been hiding assets or involved in schemes she didn't know about, his death might have left loose ends that only his widow could resolve. "There's more," Talon continued reluctantly. "The men asking questions weren't just looking for you. They were asking about anyone you might be traveling with, anyone who might be helping you. They specifically mentioned the possibility that you'd found Indian assistance in evading capture. The implication was clear. Talon's association with Aurora had made him a target as well. By helping her build the cabin, by staying in the valley instead of moving on as prudence dictated, he'd put himself in danger that went beyond the military manhunt already pursuing him. "You should leave," Aurora said immediately. "Tonight, before Webb returns, before those bounty hunters track us to this valley. I got you into this mess, but you don't have to stay and get killed because of my problems. Is that what you want? For me to leave?" The question hung between them like smoke from their fire, carrying implications that went far beyond simple partnership or mutual assistance. Over the past month, Aurora had come to depend on Talon for more than just his knowledge of stone construction. He'd become her anchor to sanity, her proof that trust and respect were still possible between two people, her growing hope that she might not have to face the future alone. "No," she admitted. "But I want you to be safe more than I want you to." "Stay," Talon smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since Webb's unwelcome visit. Cherokee have another saying: when you find something worth protecting, you don't walk away just because protection is dangerous. I'm not Cherokee property that needs protecting. "No," Talon agreed. "You're a partner who's become something. More than a partner, working on a project that's become more than just building shelter." The words hung in the night air, carrying weight that had nothing to do with construction timelines or winter preparations. Aurora realized that somewhere in the process of building a cabin, she and Talon had begun building something else, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared struggle, and growing affection that neither of them had expected when they'd shaken hands over a pile of foundation stones. What emerged from their late-night conversation was a plan born of desperation, but tempered by the practical knowledge both had gained through months of living as fugitives. Webb's presence in the valley wasn't just a threat, it was also an opportunity. As a civilian with obvious wealth and connections, he would be exactly the kind of person bounty hunters would approach for information about Aurora's whereabouts. If he could be convinced to provide false information about her location, it might buy them the time needed to complete the cabin and prepare for winter. "You think he'll lie to professional trackers for the sake of a business deal?" Aurora asked. "I think he'll do whatever serves his financial interests," Talon replied. "Right now, those interests are served by keeping you alive and hidden long enough to sign his papers. If bounty hunters find you first, he gets nothing." The plan required Aurora to appear to accept Webb's deal while actually signing documents that had been subtly altered to protect her legal interests. It also required Talon to reveal skills he'd acquired during his months of living between worlds, specifically his ability to forge official documents convincingly enough to fool casual inspection. "You can do that?" Aurora asked when Talon explained this aspect of their strategy. "Survival as a legally dead man requires certain practical skills," Talon replied with grim humor. "Forging travel documents, altering ownership papers, creating false identities, you learn what you need to learn when the alternative is capture and execution." Aurora felt a new appreciation for the complexity of Talon's situation. She'd been thinking of him as a fellow refugee, but he was actually something more sophisticated, a man who'd learned to navigate multiple worlds, while belonging fully to none of them. As they worked through the details of their plan, Aurora realized that success would require her to trust Talon completely with both her legal future and her physical safety. If his forged documents were detected, if Webb proved more clever than they anticipated, if the bounty hunters arrived before their deception could be completed, both of them would face consequences worse than simple capture. "Are you sure you want to risk this?" she asked as they prepared to sleep. "You could still leave tonight, disappear into the mountains. Let me handle Webb alone." "We're partners," Talon replied simply. "Partners don't abandon each other when Things get dangerous. Aurora lay awake long after Talon's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. Tomorrow would bring Webb's return and the most dangerous gamble of her life. A gamble that could either secure her freedom or destroy the only safety she'd found since fleeing Denver. But as she listened to the familiar sounds of their campsite, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, the quiet breathing of the man who'd become her anchor in a world of constant threat, Aurora realized that she was no longer the terrified woman who'd fled into the wilderness. 3 months ago, she'd learned to work with stone, to read weather patterns, to trust her instincts about danger and opportunity. Most importantly, she'd learned that survival was possible even when the world seemed determined to destroy you, as long as you had someone willing to stand beside you when the storms came. Tomorrow, she would face Marcus Webb with documents designed to fool him. Backed by a Cherokee warrior who'd chosen to risk everything to help her win a battle against forces that wanted to drag her back into a past that had nearly killed her. The walls of their cabin were rising stone by stone, but so was something else, a partnership that had become an alliance that was becoming something deeper and more lasting than either had expected. When they'd first shaken hands over a pile of foundation rocks, winter was coming. But Aurora Sterling was no longer afraid of the cold. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost thick enough to crunch underfoot and breath that steamed like smoke in the thin mountain air. Aurora woke to find Talon already at work, hunched over Webb's documents by the light of their carefully banked fire. His movements were precise and methodical, as he made minute alterations to the legal papers with tools she hadn't known he possessed: a set of fine brushes, bottles of different colored inks, and a small vial of what looked like acid for aging. "Paper, where did you learn to do that?" Aurora asked, settling beside him to watch his work. "Necessity," Talon replied without looking up from the contract he was modifying. "When you're legally dead but still need to travel, buy supplies, and conduct business, you learn to create the documents that make those things possible." Aurora watched in fascination as Talon carefully altered key phrases in Webb's contract. Where the original document transferred full ownership of her Denver property to Webb's company, the modified version granted only temporary management rights that would revert to Aurora after 1 year. Where Webb's contract absolved him of any responsibility for her debts, Talon's version made him liable for any fraudulent claims against the property. Will he notice the changes? Aurora asked. Not unless he reads very carefully, which men like. Webb rarely do once they think they've won. Talon held up the modified document to check his work in the firelight. He'll see his name where he expects it, the signatures where they belong, and the general language of property transfer. The details that actually matter will be hidden in legal terminology he won't bother to examine closely. The transformation was remarkable. To Aurora's untrained eye, the altered document looked identical to the original, but Talon's subtle changes had fundamentally shifted the balance of power in her favor. Instead of signing away her future, she would be entering into agreement that actually protected her interests while appearing to give Webb what he wanted. "What if he has lawyers review it later?" Aurora asked. "Then he'll discover he's been outmaneuvered by a legally dead Cherokee warrior and a murdered woman, building a stone cabin in the wilderness." Talon smiled grimly. "By that time, we'll be long gone or well prepared to defend ourselves." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and warming the valley floor, Aurora felt her nervousness crystallize into focused determination. She'd spent the night rehearsing her performance, preparing to play the role of a desperate woman accepting defeat in order to save her life. The key was to appear resigned without seeming too eager, grateful without arousing suspicion. "Remember," Talon said as they prepared for Webb's return, "men like him expect women to be emotional and irrational under pressure. Use that expectation against him. Let him think he's dealing with someone too frightened to think clearly about what she's signing. Aurora nodded, then paused as a thought occurred to her. What happens to you if this goes wrong? I mean, if Webb realizes what we've done and brings authorities here. Same thing that happens if it goes right, Talon replied matter-of-factly. I disappear deeper into the mountains until the heat dies down, then resurface somewhere else with a new identity. You'd leave me here alone? The question came out with more vulnerability than Aurora had intended, revealing how much she'd come to depend on Talon's presence for more than just practical assistance. The thought of facing the coming winter without his knowledge, his companionship, his steady strength seemed almost unbearable. Only if staying would get us both killed, Talon said gently. But I'd come back once it was safe. Partners don't abandon each other permanently. The word partners hung between them with weight that had grown beyond its original meaning. Aurora realized that somewhere in the process of building a cabin together, they'd built something else as well, a bond that transcended simple cooperation or mutual benefit. Marcus Webb arrived promptly at noon, riding into their campsite with the confident air of a man who believed he held all the advantages. He dismounted with practiced ease, his expensive clothes unmarked by travel, his manner suggesting that collecting debts from desperate fugitives was merely another day's work. Mrs. Sterling, he said with exaggerated courtesy, I trust you've had time to consider my proposal? I have, Aurora replied, forcing her voice to carry the tremor of defeat she knew he expected to hear. I don't seem to have much choice in the matter. Excellent. Business is so much more pleasant when all parties recognize reality. Webb produced his leather portfolio, withdrawing the documents with satisfied efficiency. I've taken the liberty of preparing everything for your signature. Once these papers are filed in Denver, your legal troubles will be permanently resolved. Aurora accepted the documents with hands that she allowed to shake slightly, playing the part of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. As she pretended to read through pages she'd already memorized, Webb's attention wandered to their construction project. Ambitious undertaking, he observed, studying the partially completed stone walls. Most people would have chosen wood for a project this remote. Stone lasts longer, Talon said, speaking for the first time since Webb's arrival. Wood burns, rots, gets eaten by insects. Stone endures. Webb glanced at Talon with the dismissive attention most wealthy men gave to hired help. Cherokee, aren't you? I hear your people have a gift for working with stone. Among other things, Talon replied neutrally, but Aurora caught the tension that tightened his jaw. Webb's casual racism was exactly the kind of attitude that had made Talon's legal existence impossible. The assumption that Cherokee people were useful for manual labor, but not worth considering as equals. Well, you'll have plenty of time to finish your little project once Mrs. Sterling and I conclude our business. Webb turned back to Aurora with expectant attention. The papers, if you please. Aurora made a show of reading through the documents. One final time, allowing uncertainty to play across her features as if she were struggling with a decision. In reality, she was checking to ensure that Talon's modifications were undetectable, that the subtle changes in language blended seamlessly with Webb's original text. There's no other way? She asked, letting a note of desperation creep into her voice. I'm afraid not. Your husband's debts don't disappear simply because he's dead, and your current legal status makes conventional collection methods problematic. Webb's smile was cold, but patient. This arrangement protects us both from unnecessary complications. Aurora picked up the pen Webb offered, dipped it in the ink he provided, and signed the modified documents with a hand that trembled just enough to reinforce her performance as a defeated woman. Webb barely glanced at the papers as he collected them, his attention already focused on the business success he believed he'd achieved. Pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Sterling, he said, tucking the documents back into his portfolio. Or should I say, the late Mrs. Sterling. As far as the world is concerned, This conversation never happened. What about the bounty hunters? Aurora asked, maintaining her role as a frightened woman seeking reassurance. I've heard there are men asking questions, offering rewards... Webb's expression sharpened slightly. What kind of men? Professional trackers, according to local. Rumors. Well-funded, well-armed, the kind who don't give up easily. Aurora watched Webb's face carefully as she delivered this information. Someone's offering serious money for information about my whereabouts. How much money? $5,000, supposedly. Webb's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment, revealing calculation behind his polished exterior. $5,000 was significantly more than the property transfer he'd just secured, suggesting that Aurora's value to someone else exceeded what he could gain from their arrangement. Interesting, he said finally. Do you have any idea who might be funding such an extensive search? None whatsoever. Jonathan had business dealings I knew nothing about, investments and partnerships he never discussed with me. Aurora allowed genuine confusion to color her voice. For all I know, he owed money to people far more dangerous than legitimate creditors. Webb nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through implications that had shifted the balance of risk and opportunity. In their situation, if professional bounty hunters were indeed searching for Aurora with that level of funding, her continued freedom served his interests only as long as she remained hidden. In that case, he said carefully, it would be wise for you to maintain your current invisibility for the foreseeable future. I'll make sure to discourage any inquiries about your possible whereabouts. And if they ask directly, if they offer you money for information, then I'll tell them the truth that Aurora Sterling is dead, and any woman resembling her is merely an unfortunate coincidence. Webb remounted his horse with satisfaction evident in every movement. Good day, Mrs. Sterling. I trust we won't have occasion to meet again. As Webb rode away toward the southern end of the valley, Aurora felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the larger danger remained. Professional bounty hunters were still searching for her, funded by someone with serious money and serious motivation to find her alive. What Aurora and Talon didn't know was that their performance had been observed by eyes other than Webb's. Hidden among the pine trees on the eastern slope of the valley, a man with a spyglass had watched the entire transaction with professional interest. Samuel Harwick was a bounty hunter by trade, but not the kind of crude violence for hire that most people associated with the profession. He was a former Pinkerton detective who specialized in tracking cases that required patience, intelligence, and the ability to blend into civilized society when necessary. The $5,000 reward for Aurora Sterling represented the largest payday of his career, but more importantly, it was his ticket to retirement and respectability. Harwick had been following Webb for 3 days, suspecting that Jonathan, Sterling's business partner, might have information about his widow's whereabouts. Watching through his spyglass as Aurora signed documents and engaged in obviously friendly conversation with her supposed captor, Harwick realized he'd stumbled onto something more complex than simple debt collection. The presence of the Cherokee man added another layer of complication. Harwick recognized the type: competent, dangerous, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to kill if his partner was threatened. Any attempt to capture Aurora would have to account for her protector's likely response. But Harwick was a patient man who understood that the best captures happened when targets felt safe and unprepared. Rather than acting immediately, he settled in to observe their routine, learn their habits, and identify the optimal moment to strike. From his concealed position, Harwick could see that Aurora and her companion were building something substantial, not the temporary shelter of people planning to move on, but the permanent construction of people planning to stay. That suggested they felt secure in their hiding place, confident that they'd evaded pursuit successfully. Harwick smiled grimly as he adjusted his spyglass for a better view of their campsite. Confidence was a luxury that fugitives couldn't afford. And Aurora Sterling was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Back at their campsite, Aurora was experiencing her own moment of realization about the complexity of their situation. As she and Talon resumed work on the cabin walls, her mind kept returning to Webb's reaction when she'd mentioned the bounty hunters. His calculation had been immediate and obvious if someone was willing to pay $5,000 for her. Capture, her value as a free woman, exceeded her worth as a debt settlement. He's going to try to collect that bounty himself, she said suddenly, stopping mid-motion with a stone halfway to the wall. Talon looked up from the mortar he was mixing. Webb, he's not going to leave the valley. He's going to wait and watch. Try to figure out how to claim the reward money without violating our agreement. Aurora set down the stone and wiped her hands on her work apron. I saw it in his eyes when I mentioned the $5,000. He went from satisfied to calculating in about 2 seconds. That would explain why he was so willing to discourage other bounty hunters, Talon agreed. Keep the competition away while he figures out how to capture the prize himself. Aurora felt the careful stability of their situation beginning to crumble again. Just when they'd thought they'd neutralized Webb's threat, he'd become an even more dangerous enemy, one who knew exactly where to find them, and had legal documents that could be used to justify turning her over to authorities. What do we do? She asked. Talon was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on the valley around them with the intensity of someone reading danger signs invisible to others. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd survived by making hard decisions quickly and correctly. We finish the cabin, he said. Fast as we can, winter ready or not. Then we disappear until the heat dies down. Disappear where? Cherokee territory. Not the reservation, the old lands, the places my people knew before removal. Sacred sites that most white men avoid, valleys where the spirits are said to walk. Talon's voice carried reverence and pain in equal measure. It means giving up everything we've built here, but it also means staying alive. Aurora looked around their campsite, taking in the partially completed stone walls that represented weeks of backbreaking, labor, and the first real home she'd built with her own hands. The thought of abandoning it all felt like another kind of death, another erasure of the woman she was trying to become. How long would we have to stay away? Until Webb gives up and moves on to easier targets, until the bounty hunters find other prey, until the military decides I'm not worth the resources they're spending to hunt me. Talon shrugged. Could be months, could be years. Aurora absorbed this information while continuing to work on the wall, her hands moving automatically through motions that had become second nature over the past month. Each stone she placed might be among the last she would ever set in this valley. Each day of construction, potentially the final step in a project that would remain forever unfinished. But as she worked, Aurora realized that something fundamental had changed in how she thought about the cabin and her future. The stones and mortar were important, but they weren't the only thing she'd been building during her time in the valley. She'd also been constructing a new sense of herself, a woman capable of surviving anything, of learning skills she'd never imagined needing, of trusting someone completely despite every reason to remain guarded. That woman, the one who could work with stone and read weather patterns and plan tactical deceptions, wasn't tied to any particular place or structure. She was portable, resilient, and strong enough to start over anywhere she needed to go. We'll come back, she said with sudden conviction. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but we'll come back and finish what we started. Talon met her, eyes across the wall they were building together. Promise? Partners don't abandon their projects permanently, Aurora replied, echoing his earlier words about not abandoning each other. As they worked through the afternoon, pushing to complete as much of the cabin as possible before circumstances forced them to flee, Aurora found herself memorizing every detail of their construction. The way morning light hit the eastern wall, the view of the valley from the planned front door, the sound of wind through the gaps they hadn't yet filled with mortar. Place had saved her life by giving her something to build toward instead of just something to run from. When she returned, and she would return, she would finish what she and Talon had started together. But first, they had to survive what was coming. And what was coming, Aurora suspected, would test everything they'd learned about trust, partnership, and the kind of strength that could only be forged through shared adversity. Winter was approaching, and so were the hunters. The race had begun between completion and capture, and the stakes were nothing less than the future they were trying to build together. Stone by stone. Samuel Harwick had been observing Aurora and Talon for 5 days when he made his first critical mistake. Confident in his concealment among the dense pine forest on the eastern slope, he'd grown careless about the small details that separated professional surveillance from amateur spying. It was the glint of morning sunlight off his spyglass lens that finally betrayed his position to eyes trained by a lifetime of reading wilderness signs. Talon spotted the reflection during what had become their routine morning security sweep of the valley perimeter. He said nothing to Aurora, continuing his normal pattern of checking their trap lines and water sources, but his route gradually shifted to provide multiple angles of observation on the area where the light had originated. The confirmation came when Harwick adjusted his position to maintain visual contact with their campsite. A slight movement of branches, the faint sound of disturbed pine needles, and the brief glimpse of a human silhouette were enough to tell Talon everything he needed to know. They were being watched by someone with enough skill to remain hidden for days, but not quite enough patience to avoid the small errors that revealed professional surveillance. When Talon returned to their worksite, he moved with the same casual efficiency that had characterized his morning routine for weeks. But Aurora, who'd learned to read the subtle signals in his posture and expression, immediately recognized that something had changed. "How many?" she asked quietly, continuing to mix mortar as if nothing had happened. "One that I can confirm. Possibly others positioned where I can't see them." Talon selected stones for the wall section they'd been building, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Professional-grade good equipment, proper concealment, the patience to watch for days without making a move. Aurora felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. After weeks of relative security, the outside world had finally found their hidden valley. Bounty hunter? Most likely. The question is whether he's working alone or as part of a larger operation. Talon fitted a stone into place with the careful precision that had become second nature. Also, whether he's here to observe or capture, what's the difference? Observation means he's gathering information, learning our routines, identifying our defenses, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Capture means he thinks he can take us now with acceptable risk. Talon's voice carried the calm analysis of someone who'd survived by correctly assessing threats. "Based on his positioning and the fact that he hasn't moved in hours, I'd say he's still in observation mode." Aurora continued working while her mind raced through their limited options. Running was possible. They could abandon the cabin and disappear deeper into the mountains. But winter was less than 3 weeks away, and surviving in the wilderness without shelter would likely kill them as effectively as any bounty hunter's bullet. Fighting was also possible, but that assumed they could locate and neutralize their watcher without alerting any potential backup he might have positioned throughout the valley. If they guessed wrong about his numbers or capabilities, they'd be dead before they realized their mistake. "There's a third option," Talon said, apparently reading her thoughts. "We let him come to us, but on our terms instead of his." Meaning? Meaning we give him what he thinks he wants while keeping what we actually need. Talon's smile was grim but confident. Cherokee have been dealing with bounty hunters for longer than Colorado has been a territory. Sometimes the best way to escape a trap is to spring it yourself. What Talon proposed was perhaps the most dangerous gamble of Aurora's life, a deliberate provocation designed to force their watcher into premature action while they still controlled the Circumstances of confrontation. The plan required Aurora to appear vulnerable and isolated, creating an opportunity too tempting for a professional bounty hunter to resist. That evening, as sunset painted the valley walls gold and red, Aurora made a show of preparing to bathe in the stream that ran along the valley's eastern edge. She gathered soap, towels, and clean clothes with the casual routine of someone who felt completely secure in her isolation, someone who had no idea she was being watched by predatory eyes. The bathing spot Talon had selected was ideal for their purposes, close enough to their campsite to appear natural, but far enough away to seem isolated and vulnerable. More importantly, it was positioned so that anyone approaching from Harwick's hiding place would have to cross open ground where Talon could observe and intercept them. As Aurora walked toward the stream, carrying her bathing supplies and humming softly to herself, she forced her body language to project the relaxed confidence of someone who believed herself to be completely alone. Every instinct screamed at her to scan the tree line for threats, to keep her revolver within easy reach, to maintain the defensive awareness that had kept her alive for months of fugitive existence. Instead, she set her gun aside with her other belongings well out of immediate reach, and began the process of undressing with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had no reason to fear observation. The performance required her to ignore every survival instinct she'd developed, to make herself genuinely vulnerable in order to create the appearance of vulnerability. Hidden among the pines 30 yards away, Samuel Harwick watched through his spyglass with the focused intensity of a predator, finally seeing his prey separate from the protection of the herd. For 5 days he'd observed Aurora and her Cherokee companion working together, never providing an opportunity for capture that didn't involve significant risk of violence. Now finally she was alone and defenseless. Her protector was back at their campsite, apparently focused on some construction task that required his full attention. The woman who commanded a $5,000 bounty was standing in a mountain stream, completely naked and utterly vulnerable. With her weapon 20 feet away and no possibility of reaching it, before he could cover the distance between them, Harwick made his second critical mistake. In his eagerness to capitalize on what appeared to be a perfect opportunity, he failed to consider why such an opportunity had suddenly presented itself after days of careful defensive behavior. Harwick moved with practiced stealth, covering the open ground between forest and stream with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent years hunting human prey. His approach was silent and swift, designed to close the distance before his target could react or call for help. He was 10 feet from Aurora, already reaching for the manacles that would secure his prize, when Talon rose from the stream bank behind him like a ghost materializing from earth and shadow. The Cherokee warrior had been lying, motionless among the rocks and tall grass for over an hour, his body painted with mud and charcoal to blend perfectly with the natural environment. His camouflage was so complete that Harwick had walked within arm's reach without detecting his presence. "Don't move," Talon said quietly, pressing the edge of his knife against Harwick's throat with just enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. "Don't speak. Don't even breathe hard." Harwick froze, his professional training warring with the primitive fear of sudden capture. He'd hunted enough dangerous prey to recognize when the roles had been reversed, when the hunter had become the hunted through miscalculation or overconfidence. Aurora turned in the stream, water streaming from her hair as she reached for the clothes she'd left within easy reach, despite appearances to the contrary. Her movements were calm and efficient, showing none of the panic or terror that Harwick had expected from a cornered fugitive. "Samuel Harwick," she said, pulling on her shirt with matter-of-fact composure. "Former Pinkerton detective, currently working as an independent contractor. You've been watching us for 5 days from the pine grove on the eastern slope." Harwick's eyes widened in surprise. Not only had they detected his surveillance, but they'd identified him by name. That suggested a level of organization and information gathering he hadn't expected from desperate fugitives hiding in the wilderness. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the knife at his throat. "Long enough to prepare a proper welcome," Talon replied. "The question now is what we do with you." Aurora finished dressing and moved to collect her revolver, checking the cylinder with practiced ease before pointing it at Harwick's chest. "He's worth more to us alive than dead. At least until we find out who's paying him and what they really want." "I work alone," Harwick said. "No employer, no backup, just me and the reward money." $5,000 is a lot of money for someone working alone, Aurora observed. "Most bounty hunters I've heard of work for a percentage of posted rewards. Not private contracts. Someone specifically hired you to find me, and they're paying premium rates for discretion and success." Harwick said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Professional bounty hunters might chase posted rewards for percentage payments, but the kind of money being offered for Aurora's capture suggested a private client with serious resources and serious motivation. "We're going to have a conversation," Talon said, maintaining pressure on his knife while Aurora secured Harwick's weapons and equipment. "A long, detailed conversation about who sent you, what they want, and how many other people might be looking for the same prize. And if I refuse to cooperate?" Aurora met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd killed before and would do so again if necessary. "Then you'll discover that there are fates worse than professional failure." What followed was the most intensive interrogation of Samuel Harwick's career, conducted by two people who understood that their lives depended on extracting accurate information from someone professionally trained to resist questioning. Talon approached the process with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned Cherokee techniques for extracting truth from enemies. He didn't rely on violence or threats, but on psychological pressure and the gradual erosion of Harwick's professional detachment. Aurora contributed a different kind of expertise, the social skills of someone who'd spent years navigating Denver society, reading people's motivations and desires through conversation and observation. Between them, they created an interrogation dynamic that was both professionally thorough and personally devastating. Jonathan Sterling wasn't just a businessman. Aurora said after an hour of careful questioning had established the basic facts of Harwick's employment. He was involved in something that made his widow worth $5,000 to someone with serious money to spend. What was it? Harwick had already revealed more than he'd intended: the existence of a private client, the premium nature of his payment, the specific instruction to bring Aurora back alive rather than simply confirming her death. But the core question of motivation remained unanswered. "Your husband was a front man," Harwick said finally, recognizing that his only chance of survival lay in providing valuable information. Legitimate businessman on the surface, but actually managing investments for people who couldn't afford to have their names associated with certain kinds of enterprises. What kinds of enterprises? Mining claims in disputed territory, railroad contracts that required bribing territorial officials, land speculation that involved displacing Indian settlements. Harwick's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts he'd memorized rather than experienced. "Your husband was the public face of operations that generated enormous profits for people who needed to remain invisible." Aurora felt pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed beginning to fall into place. Jonathan's mysterious business trips, his sudden windfalls followed by equally sudden losses, his paranoia about discussing work in places where they might be overheard. It all made sense if he'd been managing illegal operations for powerful clients. And when he died? Talon prompted. The money disappeared. Accounts were emptied, documents were destroyed, and the only person who knew where everything went was his widow. Harwick met Aurora's eyes with something approaching respect. "You probably don't even know what you know, but somewhere in your memories of conversations with your husband, There are details worth millions of dollars to very dangerous people. Aurora's mind raced through years of marriage to Jonathan, searching for any detail that might explain why powerful criminals would pay premium rates to have her captured alive. She'd always assumed that Jonathan kept his business separate from their personal life. But if Harwick was correct, she might have absorbed crucial information without realizing its significance. "Who specifically wants me found?" she asked. "Clayton. Morrison. Ever hear the name?" Aurora's blood turned to ice. Clayton Morrison was one of the most powerful men in Colorado Territory, a territorial legislator, mining magnate, and rumored political boss who controlled everything from railroad contracts to judicial appointments. If Morrison wanted her found, it meant she possessed information that could threaten not just his business interests, but his entire political empire. "Morrison doesn't just want the money back," Harwick continued. "He wants to make sure that certain conversations between him and your husband never become public knowledge. The kind of conversations that could bring down territorial officials, railroad executives, and federal land commissioners." Aurora realized that her situation was far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. She wasn't just a woman fleeing from murder charges. She was a walking repository of information that could destroy some of the most powerful men in the American West. As night fell over the valley, Aurora and Talon faced a decision that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the entire future they'd been trying to build together. Harwick's revelations had transformed their situation from a simple matter of evading capture to a complex political crisis that involved territorial corruption at the highest levels. "We could disappear," Talon said as they discussed their options. Around a carefully shielded campfire, "Take Harwick's information, head for Cherokee territory, and stay hidden until Morrison gives up the search." "For how long? Months? Years?" Aurora stared into the flames, seeing her half-built cabin in the dancing light. "And what about the next bounty hunter, and the one after that?" "Morrison has enough money to keep sending professionals until one of them succeeds. Or we could fight," Talon said quietly. "Use what we know to expose Morrison's operations. Turn the hunters into the hunted. That means going back to civilization, trusting lawyers and newspapers and federal marshals who might already be in Morrison's pocket." Aurora shook her head. "It means giving up everything we've built here and gambling our lives on a justice system that's already failed us both." Harwick, bound but conscious nearby, spoke into their silence. "There's a third option. Morrison's not the only one with money and political connections. There are federal authorities in Denver who've been trying to build cases against territorial corruption for years. The right information, delivered to the right people, could bring down Morrison's entire operation." "And in return?" Aurora asked. "Full pardons for both of you. New identities, federal protection, enough money to start over anywhere you want." Harwick's voice carried the practiced persuasion of someone accustomed to negotiating deals with desperate people. "Morrison's enemies in Washington would pay handsomely for the kind of information you possess." Aurora looked across the fire at Talon, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his dark eyes. After months of hiding, fighting, and building something real with their own hands, they were being offered a chance to return to civilization as heroes rather than fugitives. But it would mean abandoning the stone cabin that had become more than shelter. It had become a symbol of their ability to create something lasting together despite impossible circumstances. It would mean trusting strangers with their lives and future, gambling everything on promises made by people they'd never met. "What guarantee do we have that federal authorities will honor their commitments?" Talon asked. "None," Harwick admitted. "But what guarantee do you have that Morrison will ever stop hunting you if you remain fugitives?" As Aurora stared into the fire, she realized that all their choices led through dangerous territory. Fight or flee, trust or hide, build or abandon, every option carried risks that could destroy everything they'd worked to create. But one thing had become clear through months of survival in the wilderness. She and Talon were stronger together than either could be alone. Whatever decision they made, they would make it as partners who'd learn to trust each other completely. The stone cabin might remain unfinished, but the partnership they'd built while constructing it had become strong enough to survive anything. The world could throw against it. Winter was coming, and so was the most dangerous choice of their lives. Dawn broke clear and cold over the valley, with the first snow of winter dusting the high peaks like powdered sugar. Aurora stood beside their half-completed cabin, running her hands along the stone walls they'd built together, feeling the solid weight of each carefully placed rock. In 12 hours, federal marshals would arrive to escort them to Denver, where Aurora's testimony would bring down Clayton, Morrison's criminal empire, and secure their freedom. But freedom came with a price. They would never return to this valley, never finish the home they'd built stone by stone, never again wake to the sight of morning mist rising from the stream where they'd first learned to trust each other completely. Having second thoughts? Talon asked, emerging from their camp with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the frigid air. About Morrison? No. He deserves what's coming to him. Aurora accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm tin to chase away the morning chill. About leaving this place? Yes. Talon nodded, understanding evident in his dark eyes. Cherokee believed that some places choose their people, not the other way around. This valley chose us when we needed choosing most. Aurora looked around their campsite, memorizing details she knew she'd carry for the rest of her life. The stone foundation that had taught her the difference between building and construction. The fire ring where they'd shared meals and stories. And the gradual revelation of trust. The half-finished walls that represented not just shelter, but proof that 2 broken people could create something whole together. What will happen to it? She asked. The cabin, I mean. Will someone else find it, finish what we started? Maybe, or maybe it will stand as it is, a monument to the fact that Aurora Sterling and Talon Riverwolf were here, that they built something real together, even when the world said they didn't exist. The sound of approaching horses echoed up. The Valley Federal Marshals arriving precisely on schedule, bringing with them the promise of justice and the certainty of departure. Aurora felt her heart tighten as she watched the riders emerge from the tree line, their badges catching the morning sunlight like small stars. What followed was the most surreal morning of Aurora's life. Marshal James Crawford was a weathered man in his 50s who treated her with the respectful attention due to a crucial witness rather than a captured fugitive. His deputies secured Harwick for transport while Crawford reviewed the information Aurora and Talon had extracted about Morrison's operations. "This is explosive material," Crawford said, studying the notes Aurora had compiled from her memories of Jonathan's business conversations. "Bank fraud, illegal land seizures, bribery of territorial officials. We've been trying to build a case like this for 3 years." "Will it be enough to convict him?" Aurora asked. "With your testimony and the documentation we'll seize from his offices, Morrison won't just face conviction. He'll face complete destruction of everything he's built through corruption." Crawford's satisfaction was evident. Justice moves slowly sometimes, but it moves. As the marshals prepared for departure, Aurora made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Walking to the pile of stones they'd quarried for the cabin's completion, she selected a small piece of limestone that fit perfectly in her palm. "For remembering," she told Talon, offering him the stone, "so that wherever we end up, we'll have something from the place where we learned to build together." Talon accepted the stone with reverence, understanding immediately why it mattered. Cherokee keep memory stones too. Pieces of important places that carry the spirit of what happened there. Aurora chose her own memory stone, a piece of granite, streaked with quartz that had come from the stream where Harwick had sprung their trap. As she tucked it into her jacket pocket, she felt the solid weight of everything they'd accomplished together. Marshal, Crawford was checking his pocket watch when Talon made an announcement that changed everything. "I'm not going with you," he said quietly. Aurora's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "Morrison's crimes were against you, not me. My testimony isn't necessary for conviction, and I won't be safe in Denver even with federal protection." Talon's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd made a decision after careful consideration. "Too many people know my face, too many enemies who would see my cooperation as betrayal of Cherokee interests." "But we're partners," Aurora said, desperation creeping into her voice. "We said we'd face whatever came together. We did face it. Together, we survived it together. But surviving and thriving are different things." Talon stepped closer, his eyes holding depths of emotion he rarely allowed others to see. "You have a chance to reclaim your life, to become someone new in a world that will welcome you. I can't take that from you by making you choose between safety and partnership." Aurora realized that Talon was doing what he'd always done, protecting her even when it cost him everything he wanted. "What will you do?" "Finish the cabin. Spend the winter here, complete what we started." Talon gestured toward their unfinished walls. "Then find my way back to Cherokee territory, see if there's still a place for a dead man among his people." As the federal marshals waited with professional patience, Aurora and Talon stood beside the foundation they'd laid together. Facing a separation neither had expected but both understood was necessary. "This isn't goodbye," Aurora said firmly. "When Morrison's trial is over, when the danger passes, I'll come back. We'll finish what we started. You'll have a new life by then. New opportunities, new people who don't carry the complications I bring." Talon's smile was sad but genuine. "Don't tie yourself to promises made in desperate times." "This wasn't desperate times. This was the best time of my life." Aurora reached for his hand, holding it tightly despite the watching marshals. "I learned more about who I really am in these 3 months than in all the years before. You didn't just help me build a cabin, you helped me build myself." Talon squeezed her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Then carry that with you wherever you go. Carry the knowledge that you're strong enough to build anything you set your mind to, brave enough to trust when trust seems impossible." Aurora kissed him then, in front of the federal marshals and the half-finished cabin and the valley that had saved both their lives. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and morning frost, of promises kept and futures uncertain, of love discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. When they broke apart, Aurora whispered words meant only for him. "Stone remembers, and so will I." Aurora Sterling, now Aurora Crawford, having married Marshal James Crawford in a ceremony that made headlines throughout Colorado Territory, returned to the valley on a crisp spring morning. She rode alone, carrying supplies for an extended stay and tools that had been specifically selected for finishing stone construction. The cabin stood exactly as they'd left it, walls reaching shoulder height, foundations solid as the mountains themselves. But someone had been caring for it. The site was clear of debris, the stones were clean, and fresh mortar had been applied to sections that showed weather damage. As Aurora dismounted and approached the structure, she found what she'd hoped to discover: signs of recent habitation. A well-maintained fire ring, neat stacks of quarried stone, and tools arranged with the careful precision she remembered from their months of partnership. On the windowsill of what would become the kitchen window, she found her answer: a small piece of limestone carved with Cherokee symbols and polished smooth by handling. Beside it lay a note written in Talon's careful script: "For when you're ready to finish what we started. The foundation remembers, and so do I." Aurora smiled, picking up the carved stone and holding it to the morning light. Somewhere in these mountains, Talon Riverwolf was waiting for her return, just as she'd waited 2 years to keep her promise. The cabin would be completed, stone by stone, just as their partnership had been built with patience, trust, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth building to last forever.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.